I'm Leslie Gibson. I'm a writer looking to find a vibrant, creative, diverse community to call home. Home is that basic need for shelter, safety and support, and it's what we all have in common, isn't it? But a sense of belonging may always remain elusive. In these podcasts, I'll be talking to Val McDermott, the award-winning crime writer, folk indie band Etain Pigeons, and Keely Mills, the Chubby Mermaid, as well as poets, wandering minstrels, artists and sculptors from across the UK who will be deciding whether they're creative because of or despite their hometown. Where will I be tempted to lay down my hat, I wonder?
Make me believe in all that I don't know.
Well, this thorny decision of where to make my home isn't getting any easier, but I have met some marvellous people. I do, though, feel the pressure mounting to make a decision. And so this week, which is episode 8, can you believe it, episode 8, our mellifluous sculptors represent both sides of the argument. Should I stay or should I go, as the Clash would say. Doing this podcast has been the gift that keeps on giving because I've been able to revisit conversations and locations and arguments and decisions and journeys, all of which I've done whilst I've been sitting here in my dining room in lockdown. And I'm really grateful to all the participants and to your listeners and to the followers and to people who comment and tell me their stories. It's been a blast. But anyway, onwards. In January 2019, I moved into temporary accommodation here in Stamford. And for reasons I won't bore you with, I had occasion to go next door to visit my neighbour. I didn't know her at all, but the moment that I got into her house, I knew she was an artist. And deep joy, not only was she an artist, but she was a sculptor. That was her discipline. And I just love sculptors. Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that I love sculptors. I really don't know enough of them, but I do love sculpture. So what better way to get to know your neighbour than to invite her for a glass of wine and shove a microphone under her nose? That's what I've done. And I really felt I needed to know the mechanics of sculpting before I started to ask her why she chose to stay in the place I was planning to leave. Especially since it was a little terraced house. It doesn't immediately scream sculptor space. I needed to know the mechanics of that first. And I need to also tell you that it might sound like there's chiselling in the background. It is actually my dog Tiger, the massive Yorkie, scraping his teeth against the knobbly bits of a bone. It was either that or he was determined to perch on Deborah's head. So you can hear a little bit of rhythmic dog chewing, but otherwise, here's Deborah Proctor, Mellifluous sculptor number 1. Take it away, Deborah.
Well, as you know, I started off actually as an ecologist, spent a lot of time out and appreciating nature, enjoying what I was doing, working in the field when I first started, which was lovely. And I've always had an appreciation of art, which sounds a bit trite, but it's true. So I went to Open Studios in Cambridge with a friend of mine, and it was lettering actually, somebody was very kindly letting people have a go, and my friend who is a painter was rubbish at it, and I thought, well, I'll have a go, and I really took to it. There was something about the process as much as anything else. It was that with a very simple tool, very simple hammer, just standing in front of it, you could make this beautiful shape appear. So then I looked around for a course to do, and I found one at Whizzing Arts down by Cambridge, run by Louise Plant, who's a fabulous sculptor. And from there I started working in my own backyard, basically in the garden, bashing away, weekends, evenings, every now and again. It's fine out in the open air, I mean anywhere really. You just need a surface to work on, really, a piece of stone, a hammer and a chisel. Though I have been very fortunate in my life to travel in places where you see people in Africa sitting on the ground, holding things in their feet and working on the rock that they're holding between their feet. I now mainly work with limestone and marble, but there are softer stones, so alabaster, and there's a type of soapstone which is found in Britain called polyphant, which comes from Cornwall. I went over to this guy in Northampton to buy, it was alabaster from Derbyshire and this Cornish stone. I like the idea of knowing where it comes from.
Yeah.
I just think it gives you some connection to it. I'm not quite sure what the connection is, but it's just a feeling that it's not just a manufactured material that's appeared from nowhere. It's something that has its origins somewhere. The earth gave it form and produced it, and this is, I find, quite interesting.
So here, I just need to remind you that in episode 4, Wakefield, that was a very popular episode, Tony Wade, the community artist, talked about knowing where stones and rocks came from. For his project, Boundary No Boundary, he had gathered different rocks from different parts of the boundary, recorded their exact map reference, and put them on display. After the exhibition was finished, he planned to return them to exactly whence they came. I was intrigued about the merging of art and science. And in a way, that's what Deborah's doing, isn't it?
But it's funny though, because that's a relatively pure interaction of not altering the stone in any way. And I mean, that's something that I'm sure you've done. I do. You go somewhere, you pick up pebbles, you pick up pieces of shell, beautiful pieces of glass or pottery, or I mean, finding things when they've been digging up my house next door. I found a clay pipe today. I was really excited. Yeah, so the connection, there is still a desire to have a connection, but it almost feels, I feel somewhat conflicted sometimes, because I then want to adjust it and make it into my shape. I want to sculpt it, I want to make it into something. And there are some very, very beautiful stones that have got lots of things going on in them, different layers, different bits of crystal or whatever it might be. And I don't use those because I think they're beautiful in their own right. I prefer something that's got little or no patterning on it, so that I can then put on the pattern that I want, make the shape that I want, and then that comes out. So I don't want it to be distracted by the patterning in the stone. I think if I worked in much bigger pieces, then you could accommodate the look of the stone as well as the overall shape. So it's a scale thing as well. So far I've only worked relatively small. I tend to describe them as luggable. Bag of cement. If you can lug it, that's what I'm using at the moment. It's just a practical thing. It's just being able to afford it. Up until recently, being full-time work, it was difficult to have the time to work on anything bigger. You can buy stone directly from the quarry. Here in Stamford, we're right on the edge of the Lincolnshire limestone, so it's quite easy just to go up to this quarry and buy directly from them. They look a bit puzzled when you walk up and just want a little bit of rock, but they get used to it. But also the stonemasons have been very helpful and friendly, just saying, there's their rubbish pile, I can pick what I like off it. And quite a few active quarries still around, so it's quite easy, as I say, it attracts the stonemasons. And so if you go to the stonemasons, if they're making something for a house, a lintel or something, and it's got a crack in it, you still end up with quite a chunk of stone that you can work with. One that I've come back to a couple of times at least is making a sphere first and then hollowing it out, or making an oval and hollowing that out. It's hard to describe, but there are kind of points coming from either side. And I like that idea of using stone, testing it to its limits. If you go too far, it would crack, it would break, it would fall apart. But if you get just to the right sweet spot, then you get this interesting thing that is sort of light, but it's made of stone. I spent some time in Carrara working with marble, and again it was fascinating working in a working yard. So the artisani, the guys who stand there all day, every day, making statues, or mainly statues for the church, they're hugely, hugely skilled, and they would walk by when I was making this oval out of marble and hollowing it out, and you'd hear them go, not sure that's going to last, not sure that's going to last. So it was a challenge. I thought, well, if they don't think it can, I'm going to try some more now. And I like just to push those boundaries a little bit, or what people expect from stone, what they expect from something that's big and solid like that. All sorts of different interpretations that people put on it, which fascinates me as well. And I think a lot of a lot of people find this, what are people seeing in the art that I'm producing, or do they see what I see?
Yeah.
And I'm less happy with having to interpret for people what the art is. I occasionally feel that some art that needs to be explained is trying too hard almost. It's like, if the viewer, a reader, a listener can't understand it, then that's that, isn't it? Yeah. If they do understand it, then that's great. And if it's a different understanding from the artist, then that's great too. I don't really mind. But I find it hard to describe what my work's about because I don't always know. So why am I here? It's just by chance. I mean, I had a job nearby. I bought a house here. And as I said, to begin with, I could just chip away in the garden, but we're in a terrace here, neighbours nearby. You can hear everything. So eventually I started renting space elsewhere. And I've been doing that now for about 10 years, just getting that additional space. And where I am now is at the weekends anyway, when the masons aren't there, it is very quiet. When I started working with marble, I started to want to use power tools, and that really does annoy the neighbours big time. So why here? I mean, part of it is that I don't know, maybe I lack imagination. I've thought about where to move to, and the coast attracts me. If I was going to move anywhere, it would be where I could step out onto the coast, step out onto a beach, step out onto a cliff top. Right. Not over the edge. It would have to be that touching, smelling distance, not a few miles inland. And then there's the practicalities of what do you do? Can you afford it? Can you move to somewhere like that? It all sounds very idyllic, but then idyllic costs money usually. And if I did sell up here and move away, obviously I'd need to make a new friend base where I moved to, which is fine. I'd still have my old friends, but I just thought, well, why do you want to move? What is it you're going to? What are you leaving behind? And I still might move, I don't know, but at the moment it's just a happy space, plodding along as I am. I'm close to the limestone. I've got some connection to this area. I've lived here for 25 years now. So it's that sort of semi-connection. I had sort of romantic ideas of going to Northumberland because it's so stunningly beautiful there. And again, being relatively close to the coast or up in the Cheviots, or another time I thought about going down to sort of North Devon because it's a bit more affordable than other bits and being close to the coast. But then you think, well, particularly in Devon, it's still a touristy area. You'd be annoyed at the crammed roads or stuff like that. And yes, we get tourists here, but we're not exactly tripping over them. So I think part of me it's just nothing to do with my artistic side. It's just a certain amount of, well, I'm happy here. Why do I want to go anywhere else? Yeah. We can, we've got a good art centre, relatively good art centre. The roads are there, the trains are there. There's that sort of thing. You can run away from it quite quickly. The weather's exceedingly good here. I do like the east. Yeah. I mean, the other option would be somewhere like the Norfolk or Suffolk coast, but again, they're really popular, really busy, really expensive. So I just know that living by the coast is only ideal for short periods of time because everything gets damp, everything needs redoing every year. Your walls creep and all that sort of thing. And yes, you've got the beauty of being able to walk out of it. But you kind of think, how do I marry the bit between wanting somewhere warm and comfortable and having this dream of a wild space? And it's hard. It's hard to say, that was my dream and my dream has gone. But maybe there's a new dream. One can keep the restlessness going. Like a lot of people of my age, I think, I'll just get a camper van and off I go, And I haven't done that yet either. Well, I've made a mistake of watching something on YouTube. This woman who's an etcher, and she's got this van set up so she can... Was it an etcher? Whatever it was, it needed a printing press anyway. Okay. So she was out working in the wilds, making these beautiful pieces of artwork. And then she just pulled out this press from underneath the sort of back of the van and made a print there and then out in the wild. How brilliant is that?
Open my eyes to all that you could show.
So that was lovely Deborah, and although I no longer live next door to her, she has become a trusted friend. I'd forgotten just how much I learned from her until I listened back to this. So now we move to another one of my loves, which is Scotland. And in particular, we moved to Perthshire via Cromarty, because Cromarty, and you remember an episode came from there, but Cromarty is where I caught up with lettering sculptor Robbie Schneider. But when I started looking for houses, Perthshire called to me in a very strong voice. Robbie was leading a residential stone lettering course at the Old Brewery Art Centre in Cromarty, and you can hear through my microphone the chipping and clunking of chisel on stone as his students work way past their allotted lesson time, absolutely engrossed in their task. Really, I could have been a pipe band in the background and they were absolutely focused. I'm now in the stables with, are you known as Robbie Schneider, or you are?
Robbie,
right,
yeah.
Right, okie dokie. Can you just explain what you do and why you're here?
Well, I think largely that I'm a sculptor who works with text. Quite a lot of my work, my commissioned work, tends to be more formal, kind of more traditional inscriptions, which is where it sort of teeters on between craft and sculpture. I do quite a lot of exhibition work, which is very much sculptural. But so I'm here to teach letter cutting in stone and the drawing associated with it. I have a fantastic bunch of students who they're really an awful lot of fun to be with, and they're working really hard. It is way past their finish time.
I'm talking to people in Cromarty this week about their actual home, where they've chosen to live. Already it's a bit complicated because I'm meeting you in Cromarty. You don't live here, you live in Perthshire, and you're obviously not from there either, may I say. I've done a bit of detective work, I can tell by that accent. That isn't where you're from.
Well, I grew up in London. I married a Scottish girl, and we eventually got to the point that we felt we didn't want to live in London anymore. It wasn't a great place to bring up children. I had trained as a sculptor. I'd been trying to be a sculptor. Because of the costs involved in having workspace and the cost of living in London, I was finding it really very hard to make sculpture. So largely I'd kind of kept finding myself doing essentially restoration of sculptural objects. Fantastic training in terms of really kind of refining hand skills, but it's not the same thing. So when we decided that we wanted to leave, the obvious and sensible place to move to was somewhere where we had some kind of family connections, Scotland. Yeah, I live a little bit outside of Crieff, so I'm pretty close to Crieff, pretty easy access to Edinburgh and Glasgow, and equally London via the train. But where I actually live seems like it could be in the middle of nowhere. I live on top of a hill, there's very little around me, I can walk for maybe 30 miles without seeing a house. So it has a beautiful remoteness to it.
So lots of questions about that now. First of all, sounds idyllic. You haven't told me much about it, but I can see that you think it is. Is that why? Is it because you don't like people? Right? Or is it because the stone needs a lot of space and you need a lot of room to spread out? Or is it's just that was the place and there wasn't a question?
That is quite a difficult question, I have to say. I wouldn't say it's because I don't like people, or space is definitely a useful thing if you're doing these kind of jobs. You know, you want to be able to make a bit of noise and a bit of dust and those kind of things without bothering people. Wouldn't be an ideal thing to do in a suburban garden. But I really love the sense of tranquility that you get there. My wife goes out to work, so sort of 8:30, I have the house to myself. And particularly first thing in the morning, there's an incredible sense of sort of silence, and you feel you can do anything you want. And I don't really understand why that matters, because I don't really want to do anything that's particularly going to upset anybody else, but I like to feel that I can do anything I want. It gives, I feel that, you know, even when I was living in London, working in London, you're doing this kind of work, maybe something slightly different, but I was always doing kind of handcraft type of work, that you get into a sort of state of almost a sort of slightly meditative tranquility. And that seems to be inherent to the place I live now. It's, yeah. I live in an old farmsteading, which had sort of become redundant, and as farms got bigger and people weren't doing small scale hill farming, but it has the great virtue of having lots of space and lots of little bits that had formerly been for whatever kind of farming purposes they were, for shearing the sheep and keeping bits of kit that farmers keep, and my studio is the most remote corner of that building, and it used to be the milking parlour. It's a great space to work.
Yeah.
It's just right.
I can imagine the feeling when you, after a week of enjoying yourself and enjoying your students and enjoying that work, but also the drive home and it being there again must feel like a sanctuary, really.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So I suppose what I'm wondering is, what did you look for before you found the place that you found? So did you immediately know that you wanted that isolation, and was all the family on board? Did you look at a few different things and come to a gradual realisation that you needed, that was what you would like, the quiet and the tranquility? Or was it just the house itself speaking to you? It's different for different people, you see, so I'm just trying to figure out what it is for you, really.
Yeah, I think we definitely didn't originally think of that as a place or a requirement. I think it was more that we kind of kept walking past the house, and it slowly became apparent that it was sort of available and very cheap, I would have to say, as well. And I think it's really sort of living there that I've come to realise how much I value the peace and the tranquility of the place. And the sense of scale as well. I look out of the studio window and I can see for maybe 30 miles or something across the hills and across to Fife. And I think that is very liberating. I think just the amount of view, if I can put it that way, is extraordinarily liberating. I mean, maybe you get the same thing if you go walking in the hills. There's a sort of amazing sense of kind of release when you're up in the hills. And as you sort of walk back down to the road or wherever it is that you're getting back home from, there's always a sort of sense of anticlimax as you come back down. The world seems to get heavier again. Stone is sort of the majority of my commissioned work is in stone, but I also carve wood, I cast bronze, I work sometimes with plastic, but it's kind of sculpture with text in any material that seems to make sense at the time.
I am absolutely there with you. I'm imagining, I'm looking out at your view, and I get envious quite a lot doing this project, and now I feel envious. But also I do know that if I was there, I would really feel lonely quite often. So 50% of the time I would be thankful, and 50% of the time I would really feel the need, I don't know, for human interaction, I suppose. I know your family's there, your wife's there, isn't she, with you in the house? Yeah. But do you ever feel that you miss that, or is it just very easy to access, or it's not really a problem?
It's not a problem at all. I think part of my sort of, I don't know how to express it really, but part of my sort of creative requirements, maybe it's just my personality, I've always liked to spend a fairly decent amount of time by myself. And I don't have any problem with that. There's far more to do than there's ever time to do. Yeah. So, yes, I love spending quite a lot of time by myself. Not exclusively. I do think it's important to spend time with other people, and particularly with other creative people. Yes, that's exactly the point of the podcast, because do they stimulate your work? They start conversations? All of that, absolutely. You share and exchange ideas, share and exchange kind of practicalities of, where there's some decent stone available or whatever it may be at the moment. But also, I think it would be true to say that probably for an awful lot of people who make sculpture or paint or do whatever it is that they do, very few people really know what they do, apart from other people who do it. And particularly if the focus of my work is sort of based around lettering, very, very few people have any clue why lettering might be an interesting thing. So spending time with other letterers and you can start to talk about all the sort of, the gruesome detail of what lettering's all about, is fantastically refreshing. So I do so on a regular basis.
But from your point of view, what is it? What would those conversations be like with people who do the same thing?
Well, I mean, it can be from, really the detail of the everyday sort of functions of actually carving or making a way of designing lettering. But I think what interests me quite a lot is where I think possibly we differ slightly between sculpture and writing, is that as soon as we see words, if it's a printed text or whatever, we largely read them and understand or not what they mean. We don't very often think about the form in which they're being presented to us, unless you're reading E. Cummings or something like that, where he made a particular sort of feature of the way in which he presented those words to you. Working with text in materials, it becomes a slightly different thing, I think. If you go and look at a Henry Moore, you don't need to understand any narrative. There's an emotional response, a physical response to the scale, the material, the form that you see before you. So for me, at least, what I do is not exclusively about the words and what they say or mean. I think it has to be about those things, but it's also has to be about the physical form and the material that's used, the sort of formal aspects of sculpture that are involved in making those words into an object. So a lot of what I'm looking to try to achieve is a relationship between the text and the form, physical form of the object, that affects the meaning of each. So the text itself is no longer just a text. The form itself is no longer just a form. It's somewhere in between the two, and hopefully more than either of them.
Can you remember a point where your interest was sparked and you started to go into that line of work? I'm imagining it wasn't a eureka moment, it would be a gradual...
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, when I was about sort of 14 or so, I fondly imagined myself being kind of physically photoshopped into some of those lovely photos that you see of Brancusi in his studio, or Henry Moore carving some ludicrously large piece of something or other. Yeah. So that would be, I suppose, the beginning. So my focus and interest really very much was in sculpture and what that might mean, what our physical relationship with physical objects is and how that might express something, what it is to be what we are, humans. Yeah. Later, I was just trying to get work. So I was carving stone because I was able to do it, and doing carvings for buildings, sort of coats of arms and stuff for buildings. And people kept rather annoyingly asking me to put a little text, it may be the motto that went with the heraldry or whatever it was. And after a bit, I realised that I really didn't know anything about how to carve lettering or what lettering should be, so I thought I'd better start to learn. So initially I would say that the fascination was simply with the fact that it was such an exacting form of carving. You can get away with a millimetre or two here or there in most forms of figurative or relief carving. With lettering, you really can't. And after a while I started thinking, well, so what does it mean if I take a beautiful line of poetry? I've probably slightly damaged it by taking out of context of the poem before I've even begun. I then do some beautiful lettering and I carve it beautifully on a piece of stone. Have I really contributed anything to that beautiful line of poetry? Was it not just as good written on the back of an envelope, or even better when it was just in the book of poems? So I started to think, well, how can I contribute to text, to words, if I'm going to be carving them in stone or wood or whatever? So the whole kind of process started to evolve, and I started thinking it maybe needs to be more than just a beautiful line of text that I've stolen from rather good poets. So it was about, really that my origins weren't as a letterer, they were as a sculptor.
Make me believe in all that I don't know.
Just highlighting the small world we live in, by the by, it turned out that Robbie had done some commissioned work in my hometown of Kirkcaldy. So I was able to have a chat to him about all things Kirkcaldy. And later that evening, one of his students revealed that she had produced a commissioned poetry stone outside the art centre in Stamford, the town that had been my home for the past 30 years. So the coincidences keep on a-coming. What did Robbie think of Kirkcaldy?
Make me believe in all that I don't know.
it's quite a remarkable place for somewhere that's sort of, this is very much not on the tourist map of Scotland,
really
I don't think, all due respect.
Don't know what you mean.
But there are really a surprising number of incredibly beautiful buildings, and the impression I got is that at some stage at least it must have been a pretty rich town to have built things with such sophistication and such care. There's a lot of very decorative stone carving and really considered and thoughtful architecture. It's got a lot of beauty in
It has a little
in it.
And you've done some work there, haven't you?
Yeah, there are 14 panels that are placed outside some of the shops in the high street, which are to give a little reflection of what those shops have been at some stage in their past. So there's a carving that describes what it was they did, maybe a pair of hair scissors and stuff for hairdressers, an ice cream cone on one of them because there was an ice cream parlour there, and it gives the name and the date that it was that. Well, let me know if you find them.
I would have to say that in the editing process, I have listened to Robbie tell me over and over and over and over and over and over again about his never-ending view. Editing is quite repetitive, but very enjoyable because you really listen hard. But his never-ending view has made me much more aware that I have compromised in my choices, and I really wonder if it's all been worth it. Although I see no other houses from at least one side of my current house, and I do have, as my friend's Mancunian partner says, a horizon, it's an illusion of sorts, and I'm feeling a little hemmed in. I'm really not sure how this is getting any easier. Thanks for that, Robbie.
Great pleasure.
Make me believe in all that I don't know.
Next time, we talk to Lois Weaver of the groundbreaking theatre company Split Britches, and we start to reflect upon the moving process. It's a moving process. See you then.
Cold.
The Way Home Project is written and presented by me, Leslie Gibson. Music and project artwork by the Tin Pigeons. Get off now and plug to the pod website for more insights, comments and transcripts, along with photos and bits of other fluff and stuff. Remember to describe and subscribe, and invite your friends along so you can talk about me afterwards. More next week.